Thank you. Okay, so I'd now like to introduce our final speaker, who is Dr. Angela Dwyer, Associate Professor of Police Studies from the University of Tasmania. Angela Dwyer is an Associate Professor in Police Studies and Emergency Management in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Tasmania and the Deputy Director of the Tasmanian Institute of Law Enforcement Studies. Angela conducts research on the intersection between sexuality, gender diversity and criminal justice and is lead editor of the book Queering Criminology. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi everyone, and thank you for the invitation to come along today, Catherine. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on here today, the Kulin Nations, and offer my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This is pretty important to me because in most of the research projects that I do, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are always overrepresented. I'm very passionate about the issues I'm going to talk to you about today, and to do that I need to go back in time a little bit and be a little bit personally reflective, if that's all right, because it does contextualise how my work came to be and why it continues to be such an important focus into the future. So I was born in Queensland and was raised on the stolen lands of the Gubbi Gubbi people, an absolutely magical place at the foot of Mount Biwa. I grew up in a family that was, in the words of my psychiatrist at my final appointment with him when I was 24, the most dysfunctional family system I've ever seen in my 40-year career. Chronic alcoholism, family violence, serious disabilities, substance abuse and intractable mental health issues meant that my upbringing on good days was turbulent at best and mostly at the hands of my father. One of my clearest memories was a day that irreparably shaped my future. My dad had driven away from our farm in our car, quite drunk, after a huge screaming, pushing, door-slamming argument with my mum. And just myself, my mum and my brother remained at home. Dad had not taken his medication that day because it was one of those days that he decided he was well enough that he didn't need it. Mum was genuinely terrified about what would happen when Dad returned, so she called our local police station. An officer answered our call, and I was standing next to Mum as she proceeded to tell the officer what had happened, quite a bit about our history, and that we were currently at home fearing for our lives. The officer on the other end told Mum there was actually nothing they could do for us, unless they'd physically assaulted one of us in some way. Mum said she was pretty sure that that was what was going to happen, but the officer insisted they couldn't help us because the legislation clearly stated that there needed to be some form of physical assault before they could do anything in terms of action. Mum hung up and started to sob. Our calls for assistance to what really was our last line of defence went unanswered, and we were literally at the mercy of Dad at that point. Lacking a car and any extended family support being more than an hour's drive away, all we could do was stay and hope for the best. Although at this point in my life I didn't even know I was a queer woman, and clearly my queerness had nothing to do with that situation. I did feel the full force of when emergency responders just don't respond. Admittedly, this moment was set in a particular period of time when legislation was very limited around family violence, and the police response, I would imagine, was a fairly standard one. And I know things have changed quite substantially now in that area. Nonetheless, it motivated the work that I do today. Even though I was told that university was a waste of time for me because, to quote my dad, "You're a woman and you should be looking after children." And even though I barely scraped through high school doing homework in the library in my lunch hours, after leaving home at 17, I proceeded to be the first in family to attend university and to do a PhD. It was in uni that I began to learn about who I was as a queer woman, only to realise that, of course, that I was the type of person my dad despised so much and would talk about so disparagingly. Even so, after growing up in a rural area where nobody spoke of queer folks unless it was about harming them in some way, uni was the first time I learned words to describe myself. Importantly, I also learned I could use the knowledge-building system of universities to try and bring about change within the systems that failed to protect our family. For the past 13 years, that's what I've tried to do. and I have focused on queer experiences with frontline emergency response and criminal processing systems, and in particular with police. I used a criminal processing system deliberately because I, along with a lot of other academics and activists, genuinely believe that justice is a fraught concept in these systems, and I still question whether or not it is something that we can achieve in those systems in the way that they're structured currently. This work is hard and complex, and there are days where I'm left sobbing on my keyboard when I read through the stories that I've heard the previous day. In my work focused on police, I've heard firsthand from young adult lesbians that have seen attitudes police shift during their interaction with them because they have short hair and they wanted their girlfriend to support them when they were bleeding after being physically assaulted by a member of the public. I've chatted with transgender young people who have had their wigs forcibly removed in public by a police officer when they were having an interaction with them. I've spoken with lesbians who have been asked very inappropriate questions by officers about whether or not the other lesbians they were hanging out with in a park were their girlfriends or just hookups. And then those lesbians have been subsequently criminalised through charges of assaulting an officer, resisting arrest, and offensive language when they responded to those questions with alcohol-fuelled anger and violence. I've interviewed young gay males that have evaded a cab fare because they have no money and are quite drunk, and they're subsequently violently arrested, violently like smacking their heads into the front of the car violently, by police, put into a paddy wagon, driven around while having Britney Spears songs sung at them for 2 hours. And I know these officers were only disciplined by their organisation, nothing more. And I have met bisexual young males that have experienced the same police non-response as me, calling for assistance to have them turned away by parents who claim everything is fine. These issues are, of course, not only impacting on LGBTQ members of the public, they also impact the response workers as well. In my projects with police, I've spoken with lesbian officers who have been transferred to a remote police station and their female partner, who is also an officer, to another station 7 hours drive away, so they'd be forced to separate as a historical punishment for being a lesbian police officer. I've conducted research projects where every single police officer who is male has withdrawn from the research after volunteering to be involved because they feared the possible ramifications of talking about being a gay male officer in the past in a police organisation. And I've been told off the record that there are a lot of male officers that are currently working in police organisations across Australia, but they would never come out. The paramedics have suicided because they were queer and could not deal with the thought of disclosing that to anyone. And that queer identifying firefighters would never dare disclose this to their workmates in the current environment, so they continue to hide their lives as a safer option. All of these experiences significantly impact the lives of LGBTQ people and show the importance of documenting these experiences in the bureaucratic, overworked and underfunded, perhaps undertrained, very complicated emergency response and criminal processing systems. It's not all doom and gloom though. There are many moments where I speak with officers and support workers who go above and beyond their role to provide the best possible support for LGBTQ people. And I hear this from the people themselves about how they've been treated with dignity and respect, and particularly from people that are sexually assaulted, and sometimes even from people being processed as offenders. So I heard from a lesbian young person who was well known to police as a victim and an offender, who was escorted home by a police officer that knew her because she was seriously intoxicated, because they wanted to make sure she was okay. That's good. We're making small progress. It's very clear that these systems are starting to listen when we say that stuff needs to happen. And that some of these organisations are doing really good work with building important initiatives. But not everybody thinks this though. There are many people that completely reject what these organisations are doing and that reject working with these organisations in any way. I have literally lost friends because I'm a police apologist. because I'm passionately dedicated to the notion that we must work with these organisations into the future. We need to keep doing this work because of situations like the raid at Hares and Hyenas, and for all the queer people that I know and love, and for my 17-year-old who's currently undergoing a gender affirmation process in Tassie and is verbally abused and gets weird stares with disturbing regularity at her workplace when she's selling people clothes, on buses, at her local gym and walking down the street. These are all the reasons why that I vehemently argue that working with these organisations continues to be a national imperative that we need to focus on to make LGBTQ lives better. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne.